Hello everyone, so this is Ram from Fourth Ventricle, and today we're going to be discussing the ventricular system and cerebrospinal fluid. So this picture here showing the ventricular system might look quite complicated at first, but after we get into it, I hope things become much clearer. So let's begin. So what are the ventricles of the brain? So these are essentially cavities within the brain that contain cerebrospinal fluid. And the functions of these ventricles are to transport the cerebrospinal fluid. They also provide protection for the brain, buoyancy, and also chemical stability for the brain to carry out its functions. So the cerebrospinal fluid is produced by something called a choroid plexus. So each ventricle contains a choroid plexus, and choroid plexus is made up of choroid epithelium, which is basically a cuboidal shape of epithelium. And the ventricles of the brain consist of two lateral ventricles, a third ventricle, cerebral aqueduct, and the fourth ventricle. The lateral ventricles are connected to the third ventricle by the interventricular foramen of Monro, and the third ventricle is connected to the fourth ventricle by the cerebral aqueduct. So I'm now going to show this to you on the picture over here. So over here you can see the lateral ventricle over here, which is a C-shaped ventricle, like this. And this is the third ventricle over here. So the lateral ventricle is connected to the third ventricle by the interventricular foramen of Monro, seen over here. You can also see the third ventricle over here. And the third ventricle is connected to the fourth ventricle, this is the fourth ventricle, by the cerebral aqueduct, which is the structure shown over here. So moving on to the lateral ventricles, so these are a pair of C-shaped ventricles in the cerebral hemisphere. They consist of the left and right lateral ventricles. So they are composed of horns that span between different lobes of the cerebrum. So for example, the frontal horn extends into the frontal lobe. The central part, or the body, is located in the parietal lobe. The posterior horn is located in the occipital lobe, and the inferior horn is located in the temporal lobe. So let's have a look at what this would look like. So this is a perfect example of how the lateral ventricle looks like. It's C-shaped, and as you can see, you have the frontal horn here, or the frontal portion. So this extends into the frontal lobe. This is the body, or the central part, which is located in the parietal lobe. This is the posterior horn, located in the occipital lobe. And over here you can see the inferior horn, which is located in the temporal lobe. So now let's talk about the third ventricle. So as I said before, the cerebrospinal fluid from the lateral ventricles drain into the third ventricle by the interventricular foramen of Monro. So the third ventricle, it's located in the diencephalon, specifically in between the thalami. So the CSF from the third ventricle drains into the cerebral aqueduct, which transports the CSF into the fourth ventricle. Now let's talk about the fourth ventricle. So the fourth ventricle is the most inferiorly located ventricle. It is located in the brainstem at the junction between the medulla oblongata and the pons. So it receives CSF from the third ventricle through the cerebral aqueduct, and it drains into the spinal cord through the central canal. It can also drain into the subarachnoid cisterns through the foramen of Magendie and the foramina of Luschka. So now let's do a quick recap. So as I mentioned before, you've got the C-shaped lateral ventricles here. So you have the frontal horn, you've got the central part, you've got the posterior horn and the inferior horn. This is the third ventricle here, connected to the lateral ventricle by the interventricular foramen of Monro. You have the fourth ventricle shown over here, connected to the third ventricle by the cerebral aqueduct. And as you can see here, the fourth ventricle drains CSF down into the central canal, shown over here. Now, let's move on to the most important section of my videos, the active recall videos, where we actually find out if you guys learned anything. So here are the questions. So feel free to pause the video now because after each question I'll be discussing the answers. So first of all, the first question, drainage of cerebrospinal fluid from lateral ventricles to the third ventricle is through. So this is through the interventricular foramen of Monro. Second question, drainage of cerebrospinal fluid from the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle is through. So this is through the cerebral aqueduct. Cerebrospinal fluid is produced by, cerebrospinal fluid is produced by the choroid plexus. The last question, cerebrospinal fluid drains from the fourth ventricle into which two places? So as we discussed, it could either flow directly into the spinal cord through the central canal, or it could flow into the subarachnoid cisterns. Thank you everyone for watching my video. I really hope it helped. Please leave a like and subscribe. Thank you so much.